Right, guys. Where are we? Right, you might need to turn up your volume. This is as loud as it's going to get. Right, it's up to you. So, Homefront Challenge 8 Mark Essay Help. First of all, I'm going to go very quickly over how to structure the essay. As we know, the marks are awarded: a 1 for introduction, 1 for your conclusion. You get a mark for sorting everything out into the correct order and putting it in paragraphs. And you get 5 marks for each of your main body paragraphs, which makes you get 8 marks in total. So, your introduction. You start with a topic sentence using words from the question. Then you simply state what you're going to write about. Your main section, made up of 5 paragraphs. Each paragraph starts with a topic sentence, i.e. what factor you're going to look at. For instance, the first factor I'm going to look at the British civilians had to endure is, or the first hardship I'm going to look at the British civilians had to endure during the war is food rationing. And then you provide 3 or 4 short sentences expanding on each topic, on this topic. For instance, food rationing was introduced in 1917, it was a response to blah blah blah, this meant that, blah blah blah, etc. And then you finish each paragraph by referring back to the question. I would say that food rationing was one of the worst hardships that British civilians endured during the war because lack of food, etc., etc. Right? Your conclusion. Begin this paragraph with the words, "In conclusion, I have been looking at the hardships faced by British or German civilians," whoever you're doing. Then you're going to briefly outline the areas that you've covered. I have been looking at food shortages, munition factory workers, etc. And then you answer the question, okay, with a sentence at the end. So the most important hardship that they had faced, in my opinion, was whatever. So the British home front. We'll start here. Food supply. Before the war, Britain imported a large amount of food. The Germans decided that they were going to try and starve Britain out of the war by surrounding the country with, or sort of attacking British merchant shipping that was bringing food in from other countries around the world, including America, for U-boat campaign. So the British government started up something called the Ministry of Food. This encouraged people to try not to waste food and to try and grow their own. Wastage, i.e. rice thrown at a wedding. We don't maybe think of that now. We think of confetti being thrown at a wedding, but back then they used to throw rice. So they tried to stop that. And then finally in 1917 they introduced rationing, which meant everybody, in theory anyway, was meant to be getting the exact same amount of food each day, which meant nobody starved, but it's a hardship because it means you can't eat whatever you want. It means you have to have whatever the ration is for that sort of week, whatever amount of food you're allowed that week. Next up, women. British home front affected, or women were affected in the British home front because now instead of working in domestic services as cleaners or maids or staying at home and looking after the children, etc., all the men are away to fight, so they need to go and work in the factories. As we know, when they worked in the munitions factories, some of them were called canaries because they looked like yellow canaries as a result of TNT poisoning. Another hardship for women on the home front was they waited every day for that telegram to come from the front to be told that their brother, son, husband, whoever it is, has been killed. So that's another hardship women had to endure, the news of the death of loved ones from the front. Propaganda, people weren't told the truth, the government distorted it, they mocked German civilization and culture, trying to convince the British public that they were on the good side and the Germans were the bad side, obviously so that people would stay behind or still support the war despite what was happening to their lives. Recruitment, young men were encouraged to join through posters, etc. And then remember after the Battle of the Somme in 1916, when people realised, hold on a minute, it's not a holiday you're going over there for, people are actually dying, recruitment fell, people stopped wanting to join, so conscription was introduced in 1916, and by the autumn of 1916 it was compulsory for all men between 18 to 41 to do military service. I've just missed out there, just go back to that. White feathers were given to people, this is obviously before the Conscription Act. Women would walk up to young men in the street who hadn't signed up and give them a white feather, because a white feather was a sign of cowardice. So it was this kind of forcing them to join. So that was a hardship that young men and men of 18 to 41 had to endure. The idea that they were forced into joining the army. And lastly, Defence of the Realm Act. Well, this gave a lot of hardships because it meant the government had to take in huge control of people's everyday lives. Before World War I, the government believed they shouldn't have, it's nothing to do with them what people did. so they didn't get involved in it. But now, because of the total war and the size of the war, the battle that they were going to have to fight, they decided they needed to control more or less every part of people's life. So, censorship of the press, the newspapers weren't allowed to report what they want. British summertime was introduced to give longer daylight hours. Pub opening hours were limited so that people maybe who were working in factories or building ships wouldn't be on a Friday or Saturday night getting drunk and then being hungover the next day. And DORA 40B, cocaine and opium outlawed in the first drug laws the country has ever seen. So there's 5 paragraphs you could stick in about sort of what life was like for British folk on the home front. Remember, you've got to put a spin on it. It will never be an 8-mark essay where it says describe what life was like. It'll always say what was the most important factor, what was this, what was that. So you need to put a bit of argument into it. Right, now to the German folk. German home front. Yep, there was loads and loads of food shortages. The first one that we should all know about were the pigs. The Allied naval blockade blocked off German ports, so they couldn't get supplies in from the sea, and that worked because it cut off fertilisers. Fertilisers are used to grow crops. To make this problem worse, pig farmers also fed their animals with grain and potatoes, which caused a bit of a shortage. So the German government decided to slaughter all the pigs. But that, in the long term, meant it created a shortage of meat. So the naval blockade, although it initially only cuts off fertilisers, it has an impact further down the chain. Another food shortage, we know about the turnip winter. The naval blockade was made worse by a poor harvest where they didn't get as much crops, and then in winter 1916-17, many people had so little food, all they had to eat was turnips. And as we see there, written just there, the calorie intake of average adults was only half what was actually needed. So, a leather shortage. The naval blockade also meant there was a shortage of leather. Leather is very, very important back then because it was used to drive machinery. The belts to turn the cogs sort of thing was made out of leather, so they replaced it with cotton, which in turn caused a cotton shortage. We've seen, I'm sure you remember in textbooks, the guys wearing the vest. Well, nobody's wearing it, but the picture of the vest, and it's made out of paper. And because obviously there's such a leather shortage, people start wearing wooden shoes instead of having leather, so obviously not very comfortable. A coal shortage. The naval blockade reduced the amount of coal coming into Germany, which is a massive, massive issue because coal makes gas, it makes electricity, and that's what keeps your war machine, your factories, your people, that keeps everything going. So if you have a coal shortage, then that's going to cause massive, massive amounts of headaches for the German civilians as they go endure very cold winters, etc., etc. And lastly, same in the British for the British home front. There was propaganda. Distorted the truth. They tried to make the British and the French look uncivilised, so that the Germans thought, right, we're on the side of good, the British and French are on the side of bad, and hence to increase or encourage the support for them for the war. So that's it, guys. Just make sure you know that, or make sure you know all these sort of factors, and any other notes that you've already got, that's great. And remember that when you're doing the essay on Monday, I'll explain this on Monday anyway, that you need to put a slant on it. The essay is going to ask you to argue something. You need to remember to do that. Okay, so I'll just stop recording.